Welcome, everybody. What a great conference. I've learned so much already. I can't wait. My name's John Cayley. I'm a professor in the Department of Literary Arts. I'm going to just name our panelists initially: Sawako Nakayasu, Scott Anderbois, and Matthew Reynolds. I will very briefly introduce them, each when it's time for them to speak, and we will have 15 minutes each. Then we will have a discussion amongst the panelists, and then it will be open to Q&A. So our first speaker is Sawako Nakayasu, who is an artist working with language performance translation. Her newest books include, notice books for newest, Pink Waves. Sawako is also recently promoted, yes, as an associate professor in the Department of Literary Arts with tenure. And she's the author of this pamphlet, I'm going to take a little time, which is Say Translation is Art. A lovely little pamphlet. I had it in my bag and then left it in my office. You should check it out. But I want you to notice two things about it. One is that it's that word say in that context, so difficult to translate because it's say as a proposal or a challenge. Say translation is art. But it also refers to the verbal, the human embodied speech as essential translation. It makes constant reference to it. The book repeats say as a challenge and a proposal all the way through every single nugget, every paragraph. Sawako.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for this beautiful conference. Thanks, John, for the introduction. I just want to say that I've got self-made bootleg copies of Say Translation is Art. I can sell it to you in the back alley later. I am here to talk about a project that I've been working on with Brown University Digital Publications. I want to give my huge thanks to Allison Levy and Claire Jones, who I've been working very closely with Allison for a number of years now. Thanks to Jane Sokolowski for the conference and my colleagues at Brown who made this possible, and also to Jovi Gastaldi, Grace C. Vicenti, and Wenjing Yap, who have helped on the media components of this. It's been a new, exciting experience for me to work with translation in this capacity. And this is the landing page for the project. I do want to say that we are very much in the thick of production right now. So this is a little bit of a sneak preview. We're not done yet, but we're in the process of making this. It's based on the poet Sagawa Chika, who is a Japanese modernist poet. I'll give you a very brief introduction just to know something about her going into it. She was born in 1911 in Hokkaido, which is the northernmost island in Japan, very remote and very rugged. The mountains go all the way up to the edge of the ocean. She was born there and moved to Tokyo when she was 17. And at that moment, she jumped into this very, very lively artistic community where they were experimenting. They were importing ideas from the West. There was a lot of self-publication happening because printing technology was improving at the moment. She died very young in 1936, so she only had 6 years of actively writing, but she published over 100 poems, many of them in tiny, tiny journals. So one thing that's fascinating about her is that for every time a collected comes out, it's never definitive because some other little journal pops out later on and we discover new poems. And she was also a translator, which speaks to my heart as a translator and to many of you as well, I think. She's interesting to me partly because she was an early translator of some of our very well-known writers like Joyce and Woolf, but she also translated many lesser-known writers, and that was a big part of her development as a writer herself. After her death in 1936, she pretty much disappeared and people were not very aware of her. Her work appeared in these very limited editions of a couple hundred copies each. They're very hard to get a hold of. But I discovered her work in 2002. And at that point, she was like officially an unknown poet. And if somebody knew them, she'd go, oh, that's everybody's favorite unknown poet. That's what she was at that time. As I started translating and publishing her work, I didn't care that she was unknown because I liked it so much. And I felt convinced and compelled just based on the work. And I wasn't very concerned with translating the greatest Japanese poet, even though I was just new and getting my footholds as a translator at the time. So you'll see 2006 was a pamphlet. 2011 was my rogue experimental self-published work that I did in the middle of translating The Collected. So you'll see that in 2010 was yet the latest limited edition that also is out of print now, but that's the book that my translation, these two are based on. And then I'll say also that between 2015 and 2022, there's a little chunk of time when Sagawa's work was more widely available in English than in Japanese because of the circumstances. And that brings us to the last 2 years. So 2022, this is the first time that her work has been widely available in Japanese. It's done really well. It's in its 4th printing, even though it only came out 2 years ago. And then this green book is published by Iwanami Bunko, which is a major mainstream canonical translation. This is like the equivalent of being a Penguin Classics, but this is just last fall. So it's really exciting to see the energy and momentum building around her work. And then on the right is another English translation in collaboration between Kikuchi Rina and Carol Hayes. So that brings us to today. This is Poet Sagawa Chika Late Gathering, and it is a born digital scholarly publication. I've been working on it with, like I said, with Brown University Digital Publications for a while now. And we called it Late Gathering because it is a title of one of her poems. It is also a title of one of her translations of a John Cheever story, and also because we are late in gathering around her work. So that's the poem. I'll go back to this if I have time, but I want to show you some excerpts from the project that we are building. And this is the landing page where I guess it's the equivalent of a cover, even though the whole point of the Born Digital publication is that it's not a book that's just online. It's made in the digital space with the components as designed from the beginning. So we have a page that helps us organize the contents of the work. She was a poet who also wrote prose, mostly poetry. These are her poems. They will be visible in English, sometimes with multiple translations, sometimes with Japanese. There are prose pieces that are important here because these are the few moments when you can see her speaking about the work, and it gives us a sense of her poetics. And then in the translation section, we have works that she translated so that we get a sense of what she was like as a translator, how she made her decisions. And one of the essays in the project by Alice Moody talks about her as a global modernist poet working through different texts from that period. So the galleries, this is the space where we highlight different aspects of the project because there are so many different kinds of materials. So one example is this gallery built around this one poem that begins with a manuscript version of her own handwriting, which is very, very rare and hard to get to. I had to travel to Hokkaido to lay my hands on it myself, but I wanted to share this. She has beautiful handwriting, I'll say that. there's a song, there's another translation by Miriam Sass. So there are multiple English language translations. Maybe I'll read this one. One other thing. A group of asparagus dives into the afternoon sun, dirty. Their stems are severed by glass. Blue blood running down the window. On the other side, the sound of a fern unwinding. And then further on in the gallery, we actually have multiple versions of the same poem by Sagawa herself. This, I believe, is circumstantial and not by design, but because she died before she was able to publish a collection of her own poetry, what we're left with is these different variations that she published in journals. So she herself has a variety of versions of the same poem, just like we do in translation have varieties of poems. So there's no stable, one single authentic authoritative version of the poem, and that exists for many of her works. So each gallery has a different concept around it. Sometimes it's thematic and based on some of the essays that were written. This is by Andrew Campana, who uses glitch poetics to give a contemporary reading of her work. I'll speak about him in a moment. And I'll talk a little bit more later about Pascal Burton and her artistic response to Sagawa. So each gallery has a different idea and a concept. This is about Sagawa as a translator and as someone who is translated. So we've got galleries and we've got essays, which would be more the traditional academic book. You would collect scholarly essays written by people who are specialists in the field. So that's what we have. They're gathered here as one grouping, but they're also combined and rearticulated in the galleries. And then I'll talk about the Zarankai first. This is also a cross-cultural project. I wanted to have an interaction between English language-based scholars and Japanese scholars. So we brought together this mode of speaking about literature in Japanese communities that might bring together scholars and poets to sit down together. Sometimes it's very casual and sometimes it's formal. They're recorded. They're usually just audio recorded and then transcribed. In our case, we video recorded and have a little bit of an excerpt to share with you. So I'm going to move to that. So this is Toshiko Ellis, who is a scholar of Japanese modernist poetry. And here we are in the Zarankai, where we're sharing some thoughts.
佐賀千佳という名前で詩を出したのは19歳の時の昆虫だと思うんですけども、でもこの詩と詩論に出たのが20歳の時ですよね。で20歳にしかもジョイスのもうご存知の通りジョイスのチェンバーミュージックのを詩学と訳して出て、でその私もたまたまずっと思っててなかなか詩と詩論見てなかったんですけど、その彼女が出た号を見たらやっぱりそうそうたるその西洋の同時代の詩人とか文学の紹介が入ってるんですね。でその中にその接触する場にいたっていうことはとても大きいことだと思ってます。でちょうど、このチェンバーミュージックの役がもちろん伊藤聖に指導されて出してもらったわけですけども、それが出た詩と詩論の第10号が昭和5年なので、1930年なんですね。でそれを見たら後でお見せしてもいいんですけど復刻版しかないんですが、詩と詩論って必ずその号の最初に表紙のすぐ後に誰か注目すべき文学者の海外の文学者の写真とかイラストが載ってるんですね。で彼女が最初にこのジョイスの役を出した時は誰だったと思う
1930年。
そう今見せてもいいんだけどなんと一番最初に彼女が出した時のこの復刻版ですけどこれなんですよ。 ガートルスタインなの。そうだから
So she goes on to give us more context about the spaces she is working in and publishing in. And let me see. I'm going to skip a little bit to, in another moment, Ellis is talking about the specific poetics of Sagawa, and she gives a reading of it that's very interesting in terms of how she handles the speaker of the poem and how it's almost not mediated, but goes directly into the subject. And I found it interesting that Andrew Campana, who came along later to write an essay through the lens of glitch poetics, was pointing to a similar thing that Toshiko Ellis, a Japanese scholar, was pointing out in Sagawa's work, but giving it a different, very contemporary and technological spin. So I'm just going to read a little excerpt of Andrew's essay where he says, focusing on the concepts of the glitch and glitch poetics, as well as the related concept of disability poetics, I will explore how Sagawa's poetry approaches mediation in a way that centers non-normative embodiment and sensation. I'm not arguing, of course, that Sagawa's work was inspired by digital media, which did not exist in anything resembling its current state until decades after her death, or even that her work directly anticipates the digital. But at a time when digital technologies have become so entangled with how we read, write, see, and think, whether or not we are actually on our devices, there's an urgency in conceptualizing the digital, or a broader kind of digitality, beyond the screen. Sagawa's glitch poetics, not despite but because of their pre-digital existence, generate new ways of thinking about our relationship to technological mediation. So I'm thinking about the ways in which the scholarship in different countries are in conversation with each other, and at the same time that a project like this allows for different modes of scholarship and artistic response to coincide. So I would like to close by going to an excerpt.
なんでじゃあ
Here we go. This is a work by Pascal Burton, who is a poet and a musician. And this is a translation of a performance translation of my translation of Sagawa's poems that Pascal Burton performed by typing and by recording the typing into a keyboard. So she calls them keyboard performances, and they're documents of her writing into a digital space based on a translation of a text. And this is why we decided to use this as the cover page for the landing page also. This may be a little bit confusing. I'm happy to talk more, but I don't want to go over my time too much. Just to give you a little sample of some of the things that are in this project. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Scott Anderbois. And Scott is Associate Professor of Linguistics at Brown and currently Director of the Brown Program in Linguistics. I was interested to hear that the linguistics has established itself as a program distinct from what we call CLIPS, cognitive linguistic, for now. Linguistics being perhaps not a science at all, not in the traditional sense, or perhaps a science that is a little bit unclear about what its object is. I don't know. Scott.
Great. Thank you so much, John, and thanks to the organizers. It's exciting to see so many people geeking out about language in so many different ways and different methods. So I want to first say a little bit about the language communities in which I work, just to provide context for the work that my colleagues and I are doing. So the language that I work with is called Aenge, also known as Kofan. It's an isolate language, meaning it's unrelated to any other language on Earth. It's spoken in, let's say, 13 communities in northeast Ecuador in the Amazonian part there that you can see highlighted in light green, and a few communities over the border in Colombia, all communities along the San Miguel and Aguarico rivers. Has roughly 1,500, 2,000 speakers, something like that. Traditionally, the Ai, the people that speak this language, lived more up in the Andean foothills and have been moving increasingly downriver into the Amazon for reasons that we will see in a moment. All right, so the Ai are traditionally hunter-gatherers living throughout that territory we just saw, and there's lots of tales of people traveling much further afield. Many Ai are still hunter-gatherers, and the extent to which this is true really varies a lot depending on the individual community and the particular situation that that community is in. So some of the communities have roads that go to major towns nearby. Some of them are a 5-hour motorboat ride away from the nearest road or cell signal. So they are dramatically different from one another. In these photographs here on the right-hand side, you can see some aspects of Ai material culture here. So this is from a photo project that a photographer named Roberto Berguera did. The top one is the cover photo of a book called Life in Oil by an anthropologist, Mike Sipek, that talks about the Kofan people and their different, varied positionalities relative to oil and extractive industry in that region, which is a huge thing there. In addition to the material culture here, there's various aspects of their traditional ways of life that are still quite thriving. So shamanistic religion and the use of yahe, more widely known as ayahuasca, among them there. Okay, so obviously the Spanish came to Ecuador, as they did to many places, in the 15th, 16th century, and there indeed were Spanish missionaries in this region during that time. Despite that, though, the Spanish didn't really like the jungle. There was diseases and things. It didn't make them very happy. And the main missionary that went there was either killed or drove off a cliff on his horse, or who knows. And they didn't really come back in large numbers. And so the Ai way of life was largely unaffected until the 1950s, when oil was discovered smack dab in the middle of their territory, in the middle of that light green dot that we have there. As you might imagine, that caused a lot of changes to happen very quickly, so that much of the colonial encounter in this region has happened sort of within one lifetime, from soup to nuts. So there's huge direct environmental impact of this oil and a decades-long legal battle that's very famous. So if you've heard of the Kofan people, either you know Ugo, who I'll mention in a moment, who is a Brown undergraduate student and a Kofan person who I collaborate with, or you've heard of these lawsuits. So there's a lot of interesting scholarship on this by anthropologist Mike Sipek, and a lot of nonprofits that are doing really important work down there as well. In addition to the oil itself, in order to facilitate oil exploration and later extraction, they built roads and all kinds of things like that, which has also led in colonization and other extractive industries like mining, which are a key concern in some of the communities now. So here's just a few images of this. So you can go take these toxic Texaco tours now, where you go walk through the jungle and see all of the oil that's still sitting there, more or less unremediated. And this pipeline is kind of an ever-present presence. That's not very articulate in this region. All right. So the work that my colleagues and I are doing is in this field of language documentation. And so I want to say a little bit about what language documentation is. So language documentation is an emerging interdisciplinary field, really, that's come into its own in the last 20 or 30 years. And it aims to provide a comprehensive multimedia, multi-purpose record of linguistic practices of a given speech community. And I think along with that, part of the multi-purpose is to do that in a way that's dovetailed with producing resources, documenting different kinds of traditional knowledge, different kinds of other kinds of things besides language. So using language as a vehicle for all kinds of other different things. And so to do this, we create things like grammars, dictionaries, text collections that people have done, since the days of Franz Boas, but also all kinds of other materials as well, pedagogical materials, electronic databases, websites, other kinds of things like that. So here's a few pictures of folks on our team engaged in various aspects of community meetings and documentation here. Okay, so our project, the Ai Ingé Language Documentation Project, is about 8 years old now. And we go down there, we collect audio and video, do workshops to allow people there to collect audio and video. As you can see here, create a digital database out of this. I can show you sort of the web version of the part of the database that's on the website there. And then we use this to co-construct community outcomes, community-oriented publications. So like an alphabet book here, we have some digital animation work that a collaborator down there is doing a lot of. And yes, to answer scientific questions about the language as well, relating to its grammar and what it, as a language unrelated to any other language on Earth, can teach us about the nature of human language. What kinds of languages are possible, what kinds of grammatical rules exist, don't exist, etc. So that's sort of the broader project. And so this being a translation conference, I wanted to talk about the role of multilingual multimedia text and the software that we've developed for doing this here. So the team's goals and the broader COFAN community as well center obviously around the language, Ayenge. And so texts in Ayenge are of course a necessity. And while there is some symbolic importance to monolingual texts in some situations, in some contexts for some people, that is ones that are not relying on a colonial language, Spanish principally, to go along with that, allowing the Ayenge to stand on its own, there are also various purposes for which translations into Spanish and English especially also play vital roles. So when we're creating these texts, we have kind of original recordings that are in Ayenge, original texts in Ayenge, and then we're often co-constructing these Spanish and English versions along with it. So for COFAN communities, this is a practical need for a variety of reasons. So first, there are much higher literacy rates in Spanish. And among people who are not literate in Spanish, there is a desire to become literate in Spanish or for their kids to become literate in Spanish. And so having these kinds of at least bilingual versions is a vital necessity for sort of economic livelihood for many people. Additionally, especially in Colombia, Ayenge is not fluently spoken by all young people in all communities. It's an endangered language. And so having a version that is bilingual is also of vital importance in those communities as well and for those individuals. Another thing that we found in beginning this project was we sort of were immediately met with this desire. We want translations into English also. So, from my perspective, this isn't necessary for outside researchers like me. If you're going to this corner of the world, you already speak Spanish. But for people there, they wanted English translations as well. And this is partially for symbolic reasons, I think, that English has a certain prestige, and so seeing that it's there is important. It's also partially for practical reasons, because people in COFAN communities have some amount of tourist infrastructure, either in the cloud forests or in the Amazon proper, or aspire to have that if they don't have that. It's also useful for researchers. Translations, of course, make the materials more accessible to outside researchers. And so I have, collaborative projects working with other folks that don't speak Spanish. And so having these materials in English as well is helpful for that. And of course, having them in Spanish is helpful for outside researchers. I think it's for both outside and community researchers an important thing as well, because we are talking about documenting an endangered language. And so better ensuring that this indigenous knowledge that's embedded in these texts, both knowledge about the language and its use and knowledge about other topics that's carried via language, are shared more broadly. And again, as I noted, there are some communities already where the language is not having robust intergenerational transmission, and for which we therefore also want to have this. Okay. All right, so this is a picture of our kind of core team from a workshop a few years back. So I co-direct the sort of this phase of the project, at least, with Dr. Wilson de Lima Silva at the University of Arizona. And we have funding from the NSF Documenting Endangered Languages program, among other groups, that allow us to go down there and pay all these fine folks working on our team there. So we have AI community members. You can see we tend to have young people because we do a lot of work with computers and digital recording and digital animation and things. But we do have some people of different ages. And we have US-based students here that are working on projects of various kinds in collaboration with everyone there. And then we have collaborations with other researchers, both from COFAN communities and from elsewhere, and then with other educators there as well. So I missed the first bullet point. So this project began in collaboration with Ugo Lusitante, who's a Brown undergraduate student who many of you probably know, or at least some of you do. So he graduated in 2019 here with his BA at Brown and is now an anthropology PhD student at UT San Antonio. So he's one of the 1,500 speakers of this language. Okay, so what our team does then is just to sort of lay out the pipeline a little bit, and then I can talk about the kind of technological solutions that we've come up with for this. So we've collected many hours of audio and video across different genres. So we have traditional stories, personal narratives, different kinds of traditional knowledge about how to make certain kinds of food, about hunting, fishing, histories of the founding of these communities, since many of these communities, or pretty much all of them, were sort of founded as such within the lifetime of people that we interview. We've worked primarily in the four most major communities in Ecuador: Sabalo, Durango, Dubuno, and Sinangue. And so we have workshops where we go down and train people in videography and audio recording and metadata, informed consent, and having conversations about where these materials might be displayed and where people want them displayed and for what purposes they can be used, etc. We train people in using software called Elan, which is very standard in linguistics. And so that software that allows you to do time-aligned transcription, translations. You can kind of add whatever annotations you want in a time-aligned way. Thanks. And you can, from there, export it to subtitled YouTube videos if you want, etc. And I'll show you sort of our interface that we've built that interfaces with that later. We also have undergraduate students here along with me who are working doing annotation of these materials in Flex or Fieldworks Language Explorer. It's a sort of purpose-built linguistic database software that is quite prevalent in the field. Okay, so we make these primary materials, annotate them, and then use them for a variety of different kinds of secondary purposes. So this includes, of course, printed book collections of texts and things like that, which both have kind of a symbolic importance and also have a practical value as well, since not everyone has devices, or at least not everyone has devices with big enough screens that they want to see things on them. I mean, everyone's got a cell phone these days, but so yeah. Okay, so we have these rich, annotated, multiply translated materials, and then we face a problem. What do we want to do with them? So traditionally, there's kind of two kinds of outputs that come from this kind of work, thinking 30 years ago or something. And we can see here the sort of two primary collections of text that existed prior to our project that show you what these outputs look like and their advantages and disadvantages. Right, so on the left, we have a collection of texts produced by linguists from the Summer Institute of Linguistics, a missionary linguistic organization that goes around the world translating the Bible and learning local languages to do that. And so they produce this text collection on the left. You can see it has all kinds of different translations, different kinds of linguistic annotations, tells you what part of speech different things are, all kinds of things. You can also see that it's probably impossible to read if you're not a linguist, kind of a pain in the butt to read if you are a linguist. And so it's sort of not very user-friendly in that sense. On the right-hand side, you can see a text collection that one of our team members, collaborators, Emachiko Amenda, made with a different missionary. And you can see here, well, this is much more readable. It looks much more like you would expect a book to look like. But now suddenly all of those different translations and annotations are missing, right? And so in creating these kinds of outputs, we have to make kind of one-time choices. What do we include? Do we include all this information? Do we include some of it? Do we include none of it? And there is no one-size-fits-all solution of what things an end user for this would want. And so what we've done in our project is create this software that we call LingView. So I don't do a lick of programming. The undergrads here do the programming. And we wrote a paper about it in the journal Language Documentation and Conservation. The code's all on GitHub, so you can use it for your own purposes. But it's software that takes these annotation files that are very standard in the field of linguistics and displays them online here. So hopefully the website link will work here. So this is a traditional story called Edición that's about a young person who is captured by another indigenous group that is known for their savagery, according to the Kofan. and taken away. So you can see here, so we have video, we have all these annotations. Crucially though, we can choose which ones we want, right? So this is an English audience, so maybe I'll turn off some of the Spanish things. I see a few linguists out there, but maybe not enough that we want to see all the morphological analysis here. And so we can take this off here, and then we play.
Edición Condasacom. Entonces, taupi se ainda que te pui, sa unga tete pa makui a teso. Hasta mani familia kahenda te pui semana kui a shimbai a shintine kui.
All right, so you get a little bit of sense of what the software is like. And yeah. Yeah. All right. So I guess I'm out of time. So Chigatsa Fepoeha, thank you. And thanks to everyone else.
Our next speaker is Matthew Reynolds, who's a professor of English and comparative criticism at Oxford University. That makes him a proper Don. I want you to refer, I forgot to refer you to the website where you can get much fuller biographies of the speakers. I also want to take the opportunity, because I just want to, for a little quip, a mode of translation, which I came across when reading the section about Balbec in Proust. I was struck by this phrase: it was her home that traveled rather than herself. C'était son chez elle qui voyageait plutôt qu'elle-même. The chez elle and home, obviously, that's a problem for the translation part. And this was about a woman who was in the hotel, who was very well off and had her own curtains, all of her photographs from home brought to her hotel room, so that she felt completely at home within the little space of the cocoon of the hotel. And I suddenly thought of this as a metaphor for a certain mode of translation, which is kind of interesting, and which has been evoked a couple of times in speakers previous, and I think also by Matthew.
Thank you. It's because I've been identified as a wanderer, so I have to have this to be mic'd up like this. I should say it's lovely to be here, and thank you so much to Jane and to everyone involved. So that's my title. This phrase, prismatic translation, which I guess I've been working with. The idea of it is to shift the emphasis in thinking about translation. It's to recognize really that translation always generates multiplicity, and to put that at the center of one's thinking. And that's been evident, in the session in various ways earlier today. I sort of explored that in this book, which was a collaborative publication that John was involved in, that was exciting, and that Sawaka's work is also discussed in. And what I'm going to share with you today is a kind of massive instance of an exploration of plural translations, which is to focus on Charlotte Bronte's novel Jane Eyre, published in English in 1847. It's a collaborative project. There's a website, and then recently published is this open access book, which is, I guess, it sits quite interestingly in relation to in a sense, more developed projects we've just been hearing about, in that it's an exploded book, so that it exists. It's got quite a lot of writing and theorizing by me in it, and it's got essays about particular translations in particular locations by my many collaborators. But it also links to interactive digital media. So there are interactive maps. There are little verbal animations. When you're reading it online, obviously you just click to open these things up. When you're reading it as a physical book, actually the book was too heavy for me to bring over on the flight. I realized otherwise I would have it because it's too big. But when you're reading it in the book, you just point your phone at the QR code to open up these interactive media. I just want to recognize the funders and assert the importance of this being a radically collaborative project. I mean, I guess like others in this session, I'm not myself a technical person. I'm just a literary person. And I found myself sort of moving into being interested in what one can do with some of the affordances of technological and digital kinds of work because of the questions that I was interested in exploring, and because I was interested in exploring them collaboratively. So for me, the kind of collaborative aspect of the project and the digital aspect of the project belong very much together. So what's the idea? The idea is to say Charlotte Bronte's novel Jane Eyre, published in English in 1847, is not just an English novel. It's been translated many, many times. I didn't realize quite how many when I started the project. It's been translated more than 600 times. Into at least 68 different languages. The idea is to say that the novel is the coexistence of all these texts, which is to say that, as we know, there's always something creative about any translation, and that creativity leaches back into the source text. So that when you're thinking about it, it really, you could describe this phenomenon as saying, well, okay, there's the original, and here are all these translations, which are kind of separate imitations, but that's not a very good description. A better description is to say, and this is what I mean by the world work, that the existence of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre is in fact co-constituted by the source text and all these translations together. And the aim of the project was to try to recognize the force of that and to find some way not just of kind of chronicling this phenomenon, but also to read it. Because there are kind of some views in world literature that, when you have a phenomenon as vast as this, you can't really read it anymore. All you can do is kind of treat it as data or as information. And I wanted very much to kind of resist that, and the other people participating in the project did as well. We wanted to sort of find a way of reading. So firstly, finding out where all the translations are took quite a lot of research. There are databases that pretend to present this information, but perhaps unsurprisingly, they're in fact radically unrepresentative, very Eurocentric. So a lot of research went into finding as many translations as we could. So you have this great mass of information. And how then do you make sense of it? And luckily at that moment, my dear friend and colleague Giovanni, well, actually I didn't know him, but he is now my dear friend and colleague Giovanni, showed up and said, well, you can make these interesting interactive maps. A map is great, obviously, in that it gives you a view of something. I think the problem with a map is that it gives you a view of something in a way. I mean, it makes you think that you have a kind of command of what you're seeing. So it was really important to me and to us that the maps should be interactive and that there should also be a variety of different kinds of them. And I'm just going to show you some of these interactive maps over the next 2 or 3 minutes. So that's one kind of map that we presented that you can kind of zoom in on and click on the dots to open it up. I like the way it represents the geographical spread of the translations. Problem with it, though, is that each of those dots has got many other translations stacked underneath it. So when you're looking at it, you can't see, how many translations there are in each place. Here's a different map, which should, I hope, start moving in a minute, which has got numbers on it, so that when as a reader, I as a researcher or as a reader kind of opening this in the book, you go in and you want to say, oh yes, look, where should we go? Should we go to Izmir or should we go to Athens? Look, there are 19 translations in Athens, and look, I can click and open up and discover the first translation in Greek and be interested in that. And then actually in the book, you can turn to an essay about the Greek translations by Eleni Philippou and discover actually the very interesting story about how come Jane Eyre was first translated into Greek in 1849. Here's a different kind of map. This was about which links covers of the books to locations of publishers where we could find out what the locations of the publishers are. It's meant to be moving. There we go. So these are translations into Persian, and really the idea here was an experiential one. And actually here I'm remembering the sort of JD or presentation earlier, which is to say, one of the things I really wanted to get at was the sense of translation as a process being done by people, and actually, the generation of this multiplicity of text is something that is happening, being done by people through space and time, rather than just something that you kind of chronicle in an encyclopedia or in a dictionary. So the idea here was to get people to spend time paying attention to the cover images, thinking about the production of the book, and having some sense of the location in which this was being done. This is another one which shows the translations appearing bit by bit through time. Whoops. Sorry. It's meant to be, not quite sure why that's not working. Anyway, it's meant to be, oh yes, because I've gone back too far. Okay, anyway, what's meant to happen, they're meant to be, I don't quite understand why that's not working. Anyway, maybe I can do it from here. Look. Yeah, so I put this on the, I mean, it's a bit absurd because I put this on the fastest setting, obviously, because time is so limited. And actually, it's much better and kind of rather calming to watch it on a slower mode. It's a nice thing to do at the end of a busy day. Actually, what I wanted to show that, I mean, a lot of translation of Jane Eyre happening in East Asia in the late 20th and early 21st century. You can see even from that high-speed rendition. But when you're looking at it more slowly, because one of the things about these maps is that they throw questions at you. So here I've wound it back just to the first few years after the publication of Jane Eyre in English. So these are translations published up to 1851. And you can see there's a scattering of them in Europe, as you might expect, but there are also these translations being published in Cuba, Chile, and Bolivia, which to me was a surprise. And then you say, well, okay, I need to find out why this is happening. So you go and do some archival research and some reading, and there's actually a really interesting story about Jane Eyre being translated into French in Paris, and then that translation being translated into Spanish, also in Paris, and that translation then being syndicated to newspapers. These are publications in newspapers in Chile, Cuba, and Bolivia, which I kind of write about at some length in the book. So I guess, yeah, so that's something about the use of these interactive maps. And I think, so the issues, I guess there are two issues for me, or maybe three. One was about just being able to understand the vast amount of information that we'd gathered. Another one was this sense of holding on to the idea of translation as a process. And the third issue for me was thinking about that mode of translation, which has also been very visible in the two earlier presentations in the session, which is the translation of one's work into whatever kind of form one wants to share it with readers in. And I wanted this book to kind of open up so that readers can explore. And the reason for that, actually, I think, is I very much wanted to get away from the notion that Jane Eyre as a world work is something that you can encapsulate and kind of command as knowledge. It's only a phenomenon that you can enter into and explore. And I wanted to, and I do some writing about that in the book, but I also wanted to give readers that sense of kind of that the book was something that they were entering into and exploring. And actually, this connects with something that was said earlier, kind of never quite getting to the end of. The other aspect, though, is reading. So we wanted to try to find a way of reading Jane Eyre as a world work. And one way of doing that, I guess, is the sort of traditional way of saying, I'm going to select this translation or a couple of translations and look at them in context and think about what the translator was doing and so on. So there's a whole series of essays in the book by my colleagues that do that for a whole range of different contexts. Because obviously, it's really important about any act of translation that it's being done by someone in a particular context in a particular moment. But I also wanted to assert that another really important thing about any of these translations is that they also participate in the larger multilingual cloud of textuality, which is Jane Eyre as a world work. And I wanted to find some way of, I don't know, making that available to experience. Obviously, when you're trying to do this, you again need to select, but you can select in a different way, so that rather than saying, I'm going to focus on this place, you say, well, I'm going to focus on this aspect of the text and see what becomes of it across multiple translations. And that's what we did together as a group. It was lovely, actually. And one of the things I most enjoyed about this project was the experience of kind of participating in collaborative close reading. One of the things we did was choose particular words to trace. And one of the words was passion. This is a really complex and important word for Charlotte Bronte and Jane Eyre because she makes an argument with it, a feminist argument in the mid-19th century, which is to say that for a young woman in the mid-19th century, the passion of love is not a tender passion or a passive passion, but it's continuous with other passions like rage and self-assertion and standing up to injustice. So the recurrences of the word throughout the novel sort of make that assertion. And so that's then a challenge to translators. So I'm just going to look at one instance of this. So this is from, you can represent the many translations like that, and I do that in the book. I find that quite hard to spend time with and read, so I did these kind of very lo-fi animations, just encouraging readers to spend a little bit of time looking at each looking at each translation. This is from a moment very early on in the book when the young Jane is fighting against her bullying cousin. And a kind of disembodied voice comes and says, "Did ever anybody see such a picture of passion?" I think this is a question for readers too. You know, what sort of passion are you seeing here? And what you find in these many translations is that different readers are seeing different things. So that for some people, this is a glorious moment, an ecstatic moment for one of them. For others, it's a moment of malice, or what's manifested as a kind of beastliness. Another thing to do, though, is to look at, and we do this for passion as well, but this is a different instance, is to see what happens to a word as it's repeated throughout the text, and the corresponding words as they're repeated through a particular translation. So another really important word for Charlotte Bronte is plain. And again, she's making an argument with it, which is to say that if you're plain looking, that's not necessarily a disadvantage because it takes you out of the social world and the marriage market, and you can see things plainly, and you have the space to speak out plainly. And the recurrences of the word throughout the book made that argument. And actually, they're contrasted and they're very strongly associated with Jane, the protagonist and narrator. And the word that's associated with Rochester is the word ugly. And he's ugly physically and he's ugly ethically as well. And indeed, if I were to be asked to do a kind of 3-word summary of the novel of the English version of the novel, it would be plain meets ugly. But in French, you can't maintain that distinction, or it's very hard to. And what you've got in the first full-length French translation by Noémie Lesbazet-Sylvestre is all these appearances of plain and ugly get translated as laide. So that breaks the pattern that there is in English and creates a differently significant pattern, which is a pattern of different kinds of ugliness coming together in the source of in the story. So, I mean, as I say, we did this as human readers with just the very basic technological help of kind of electronic text and word searches. It does seem to me the kind of reading that that AI and the new developments in the powers of technological translation could help one do a bit more of, because you follow these patterns and immediately it's just too many to follow. There are too many different pathways. We did a little bit though of close reading with digital help. So this I don't really have time to talk about, but it's a little just looking at type token ratio and seeing when the type token ratio in a translation diverges radically from the other translations and going to see why that is. I found that quite an interesting experience. And this is some ongoing work being done by a colleague, Sasha Rudan, just to sort of make it a bit easier to look at many translations together and see what's going on in them. So that's, yeah, that's, so really that there is this sort of moving into the world of the digital, which I think I could do more of. If anyone wants to kind of help me do that, that would be lovely. And I sort of, because I'm not quite sure where to go with it next. But actually, the emphasis I want to end on is that this kind of adventure of trying to read Jane Eyre as a world work, which is vast and therefore impossible, and therefore you reach out for help from technological affordances to help you do that. But it becomes a kind of reading, and it's a kind of reading that a newish kind of reading that I very much enjoyed, which I decided to call not literal reading, but littoral reading, which is the sense you're always just on the edge of the vaster multilingual text, which is always beyond your grasp. And you can, I'm quite sure where I'm going with this metaphor, you can kind of throw out a net or you can capture little bits of it or something. But the sense that you as a reader are participating in a much larger world of textuality, multilingual textuality, that you can experience, but you can't, to some extent, you can join in experiencing, but you can't ever command. To me, that was a lovely thing to discover, actually. Okay, thank you.
Well, we are a little pressed for time, and we did start late. I think we've got a good 10 minutes or so. And if you guys are ready to set off on a conversation, please go for it. I have many questions if you want to be started off.
I had a question, Sawako, about just about so I mean, it looked really wonderful and beautiful and lovely to explore. I just wonder about the sort of the moment of focus on the poem, if that's something you wanted to create within the Born Digital publication, or whether you're sort of imagining, because that is also important, isn't it? It's important to explore, but it's also important in reading to have the moment of I'm just reading this. I've got this thing. I'm just reading it. And so, do you sort of hope that somebody might also have the book of poems and then turn to your Born Digital publication, or were you thinking about how to create sort of moments of focused reading within that space.
Well, I like the idea of giving the reader all the options.
Yeah.
So you can spend your entire time with that publication, with the poems and prose and translations just by Sagawad. But I think because the essays and the other components refer to each other in so many different ways, in a sense, it's the exploded reading brought back into one place. So it's curated in such a way that you might hear one of the scholars refer to a poem in their scholarly essay, but that poem is within the same publication, and you can move and hold those spaces together. But it's not the entire work, so if you do feel inspired, you need to actually get the book and read the whole thing. So they coexist, I think. But I have a question for you, Matthew.
Oh yeah.
Well, I was just thinking about your sense of the world work and the fact that you can't command it all because there's so many. And that made me wonder how you even distinguish what gets included in a dot on the map. Like, does it have to be published? Does it have to be a big enough publisher? Can it be someone's dissertation? There must be an infinite range of engagements with Jane Eyre. Maybe there are translations that are not official or accurate or whatnot, but where are those lines?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. No, absolutely. Really good question, because there are many, absolutely. There are many kind of plural responses, reactions, critical essays about it, et cetera. So we just, and I write about this at some length, obviously, but we just had to have a rule of thumb. And I guess there were two things, actually. One was, you have to have a rule of thumb because you can't write about everything. But also, I was just really interested in the particular claim that a translation makes on the identity of the text, which is to say that if you're reading if you're reading something like White Sargasso, if you're reading a kind of creative reimagining, it says, well, I'm a creative reimagining of this text. I'm not this text. So that for me, that's the paradox of that is just the kind of amazing, peculiarity of translation, that here you have a text that's completely different from the source text, and yet it's the same again. And so we took that as our rule of thumb, which is to say the text that presented themselves, and this is the classic descriptive translation studies move, to say a text that presents itself as a translation, we'll call that a translation. But there was something, so it had to be it had to be printed, it had to be published, it had to be a work of fiction. It had to be kind of in a printed book, and it had to say, in some sense, I am Jane Eyre. Now it's complex though, because what it is to say I am Jane Eyre is different in different cultures. The title is often different, etc. So there's kind of judgment. And there are lots and lots of instances where one can contest what's included and what's not. But it's a really interesting question.
Guess we're ready to open it up.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll ask a question. I think this is
Yeah.
really fascinating. I'm glad you put your rights, I guess, to see. So I was going to ask you about that. Just two questions. You may have answered them to some extent, but how do you account for not just the linguistic constraints on a translation, but also the potential historical and political ones? And I don't know what they would be with Jane Eyre, but I was teaching last term about translations of Animal Farm, and they translated completely differently depending on who's, what your concepts are. And so I wondered if you account for that.
Yeah.
And then the bigger question is, do you read the English Jane Eyre differently yourself?
Yeah. No, I do completely read the English Jane Eyre differently. And indeed, I'm employed by an English department, and one of the things that really always frustrates me is the kind of boundary that's drawn. I don't know how strong that is here, but in the UK, really strong boundaries between the thing called English and all other languages, literatures. I mean, now actually, departments in English universities are often reforming themselves as languages, literatures, and cultures departments, which exclude English. English is different from that. Anyway, so one of the things I wanted was to show English readers why they should be interested in translations of English texts into other languages, because it was going to change how they read. The text they thought they possessed. The English faculty kind of possesses the text because it's an English literary text. That's not the case at all. And so that was one of the things I wanted to do, was to kind of change how even monolingual English readers would read Jane Eyre to something, or at least create the possibility that could change. The thing about constraints, yeah, so there are lots of, so here there are, this is in the essays that focus in on particular contexts. And it's a really important feminist text in interestingly related and yet different ways in many different contexts. So in Portugal in the 1880s, in Chile in the 1940s, etc. So there are various essays in the book that focus in on particular contexts and make that argument. But actually one thing that really interestingly happens in relation to censorship is that in some contexts, because it's a 19th century novel, it's felt to be safe. So for instance, there's a lovely essay by Van Talmasabian about translations in Iran, and there's an amazing burgeoning of translations of Jane Eyre in Iran after the Islamic Revolution in 1979, because a kind of writing that people had a hunger for was banned, and those imaginative impulses could find a vent in translations of Jane Eyre. So that's a really interesting instance of that.
Yeah, I imagine we're running out of time. I don't know if this mic is working or not. I have a quick question for Scott. I loved your text time videos, and I want those for every language. But I'm wondering if you could talk more about the materials that you create and how the community uses them, reacts to them, and how they like participate in creating the materials.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, so I think in general, like my selfish interest is in grammar, and so I don't care what the materials are about. I'm not like an anthropologist studying this specific cultural practice. And so the folks on our team who are community members have a lot of latitude to decide what things interest them to record and to, decide that in conversation with the people that they're recording. So like we have one person on our team who was working on a master's degree in agriculture and environmental practices. And so did a lot of, very detailed interviews about decisions people were making about what crops to plant and how and why. And then other people make other decisions. I think a lot of people sort of default to traditional narratives. And so one interesting thing about that we haven't done anything with yet is that we have, maybe 4 or 5 different versions of certain very salient narratives from different communities, from different speakers of different ages and things. And so there's a lot of potential for thinking about those texts and how they do and don't differ from one another, even within productions within the same language. To say nothing of the different translations that I guess we have for each one into Spanish. As far as what community members do with them, they're on the website, so people can access them there. And depending on the community, they might have internet access, they might not. The communities have high-speed internet access these days. So it's primarily in K through 12 educational contexts that we're working with teachers to create physical books, but also to make these materials go further. So we have kind of meetings with folks who are down there to think about what the right outcomes are that are most productive for people there.
And that's a great segue into seeing as that was a request which is related to teaching. The next section on teaching.